Okay, well, hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to this installment of our Providence Symposium on Housing. I'm Brent Runyon, Executive Director of the Providence Preservation Society, and I just want to make a brief introduction before I hand it off to our moderator, Carrie Zaslow. So we want to acknowledge, first of all, that the Providence Preservation Society is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Narragansett Nation. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous peoples, and PPS's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. This year's symposium explores housing in all its complexity. For most people, housing is both deeply personal and inherently political. Together, we're looking at both dimensions and considering the ways in which preservation can address the housing crisis in Providence and beyond. The next program in this symposium is this afternoon at 5:30, Why Missing Middle Housing is Key for Walkable Communities. And there are tickets available. Kelsey is backstage and she'll be putting information in the chat to let you know how to sign up if you haven't already. We hope you'll join us for that. We are recording this session and we encourage you to enter your questions in the Q&A or chat box, and we'll get to those as we can. We really want to thank our sponsor, our presenting sponsor for the whole symposium, Cornish Associates, and our session sponsor, Washington Trust. Providence has not been spared from the housing crisis facing most of the country. Like most places, housing supply has not kept pace with demand, and what housing does exist is increasingly expensive. And the city's existing housing stock is some of the oldest in the country, with almost 70% of its housing units built before 1970. Which means special attention and resources are needed simply to maintain the current supply. This panel brings together the state's leading voices in housing policy and planning to talk about the future of housing in the creative capital. What's working, what needs to change, and what role our historic assets play in solving the housing puzzle in Providence. We are pleased to be joined this afternoon by a distinguished panel of experts whom you'll meet in just a few minutes. They will discuss the topic at hand for about 60 minutes, leaving time for audience questions at the end. So again, as you have thoughts and comments and questions, please enter them in the chat or the Q&A. And now I'm pleased to introduce Carrie Zaslow, Executive Director of the Providence Revolving Fund and a PPS trustee, a thought leader in her own right on this issue, who will introduce and moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Brent. I really appreciate it. And welcome, everyone. We're all pleased to be here to discuss this quite meaty issue. As Brent mentioned, Rhode Island has not been spared in any way from the housing crisis. And in fact, the pandemic only helped magnify some of the issues that we face here in Rhode Island. Our panelists are going to go into greater detail about that. And I just want to welcome all of them here today. So we're going to begin our discussion with Brenda Clement. Brenda is the Director of HousingWorks Rhode Island at Roger Williams University. She has served in the past as the Executive Director of CHAPA, or Citizens Housing and Planning Association in Boston. She has 20 years in housing and community development. And I am pleased to say at one point I called her boss. I had the opportunity to work and learn from her. And I'm going to turn it over to Brenda to start our presentation, and we'll move on from there. Brenda?
Hi, thank you, Carrie, and good afternoon. And I'm glad that to have the opportunity to work with you. And she still talks to me, so that's a good thing. So glad to join here today, and here to be with all of our great colleagues on this discussion. HousingWorks is a research and policy organization located at Roger Williams University. I think you can click to the next one, Carrie. Sorry, I'm having some computer issues, so Carrie's pinch hitting for me. Founded in 2004 as a result of, or as the first housing bond campaign came together, funded then by and pulled together by three core funders: Rhode Island Housing, Rhode Island United Way, and Rhode Island Foundation. because even then we were acknowledging and recognizing that housing and housing issues were a challenge that we're still addressing and dealing with today. But through our research and our analysis, we try to show and connect the dots between housing and economic growth, but also between health and educational disparities and outcomes as well. Hopefully you're familiar with our annual housing fact book, and I know my colleagues Annette and Bryce are on the call today, and they play a huge role in production of that book every year. And so, but it contains lots of great data and information about the housing scene here in Rhode Island. And bad housing, pun intention, I'm going to run through a couple of slides to give you some of that foundational facts about housing issues here in the state. First of all, I want to focus a little bit on healthy housing, and because a lot of healthy housing is directly tied to not only do we not have enough housing and affordable housing in particular in the state, but the quality and condition of our housing as it ages is a big, huge issue that we know we have to continue to address and work on as a state. And how it defines has a number of healthy housing principles that you can see on the slide. And Carrie, I'm assuming that all these slide decks will be available to all participants. So in case you can't see all of these details here, but basic things around good quality that I think we all would agree and all assume that we need to see in our housing stock as well. But the age of Rhode Island's housing is a primary driver of health risks. And again, this past year and a half has shown us not only the importance of having a stable home, but having a home that doesn't make you sick is also as critical as we move forward and try to continue to recover from the pandemic. More than 52% of housing units in Providence were built prior to 1939. 84% of units were built before 1980. And obviously that puts a lot of them, particularly our historic homes, but also older multifamily and rental units at great risk, particularly if they've suffered from poor maintenance or deferred maintenance that can increase the health risks and provide instability for those families and neighborhoods as well. We knew well before COVID that zip code mattered, and the geographic location of where you live can mean a lot in terms of your health outcomes and your educational outcomes and your economic stability as well. You can keep going, Carrie. So so the other slide that we just went through just kind of summarized a little bit on issues around maintenance and safety. They're generally the responsibility of a property owner, and when such a property becomes a hazard to residents or to the public, a municipal's code enforcement officer may be involved. But as we know, code enforcement, particularly in the urban core community, is often understaffed and often difficult to kind of keep and maintain properties as we move forward. We don't currently collect these records around home maintenance and code enforcement, but something that we know that we need to take a closer look at moving forward. We can keep going. And again, mostly today I'm focusing a little bit on Providence because we're obviously at the Providence Preservation Society, but a lot of these facts and these issues, particularly around this quality and condition of housing, are true throughout the state. In general, again, no surprise, I think, to many folks on the Zoom here, owner-occupant housing stock is older than renter-occupied housing stock in Providence. Of the roughly 61,000 households in Providence, 73% cannot afford the region's median home price. Multifamily housing makes up almost 3/4 of the housing stock in the Providence region. Providence currently has about almost 15%, 14.8% year-round housing stock that qualifies as low to moderate income housing, which is good news, except Providence probably needs to be even higher than that to meet the statewide needs around housing. In 2020, 65 long-term affordable homes were preserved. Again, not losing any of the housing stock that we already have, particularly affordable, is critical to housing advocates. And in 2020, Providence reported 248 building permits. And again, we'll be talking a lot about these through some of these questions. I'm just trying to give you some of the basic information and facts to aid and inform our discussion later on. We can keep going. So not including the east side, in total, 20,000 or over almost 21,000, about 43% of Providence households are cost burden. And when I'm saying cost burden, or what I mean by cost burden, is that HUD, our federal housing agency, determines that if you spend more than a third of your income on housing, you're considered cost burden, or your budget is out of whack and you're spending more on your housing, whether it's rental or a mortgage payment than you can comfortably afford. When you're higher income, those choices between, if your cost burden are, you may not put as much into savings, or you may not buy a second car, or you may not go on a vacation. As you go further down the income spectrum, those choices become much more dire. You have to choose between food and rent, and rent and heat, and rent or mortgage payment, and picking up your prescriptions. So we know that particularly for many lower income individuals, those maintaining their house is very challenging, in particular in this high cost market. Again, from 2015 to 2020, there has been a 71% increase in the median single family home price in Providence, excluding East Side. In the same time, there has been a 5% increase in price of the average 2-bedroom rent in the city. And again, I think there's been good documentation in media and other cases about the housing shortage and the housing crisis that we're currently underway in our state and across the country. Can keep going. So Providence's East Side, as you know, generally these statistics are kept separately just because the amounts often skew the results. But in total, there were 4,500, or about 36% of East Side households are cost burden. I think many of us don't think about East Side folks as being cost burden, but they are there, as they are in every community in the state. The median single home price on the East Side is 2.87% times higher than the rest of Providence. Median household income on the East Side is almost twice that of the rest of Providence. And housing tenure on the East Side of Providence has a higher share of owners, at 44%, than the rest of Providence. And we can keep going. So this is the other side. Again, as we know, housing prices have increased both on the home ownership and rental side. And so, isn't this just an economics problem? If demand is high, shouldn't supply increase? Well, you would think that, but the reality is that that has not been the case. And you can see on this slide here, our last peak in production was a long time back in 1986, when we saw a high of housing production. It was even, you don't see it on this chart, but housing permit activity has still been relatively low and definitely not keeping up with the pace of demand. And thus we have still extremely low inventory of home ownership or homes for sale, and very low vacancy rates on the rental side, hovering around 2 to 4% in Providence. We can keep going. So here's what I was starting to say, that in the 80s, with the high watermark was in 1986. In the 1990s, the high was 3,400 permits. And from 2000 to 2009, we have only been doing about 2,000 permits. 2010 to 2020, only about 1,000 permits. Again, nowhere near keeping up to level of demand. And I think that's it for me for right now. But again, I look forward to answering any questions as we proceed through in Q&A.
Brenda, before we move on to the next person, I just have one question that I would like you to, I'd like to just talk about quickly, sure. Which is, you talked about households that were cost burdened. And for homeowners that are cost burdened, who either own their home as a single family home, or for those who are landlords and have a multifamily home where they have tenants, are there, what should they be doing if they have an older home and they have maintenance issues and they're having a hard time affording them? Mm-hmm. What kinds of programs are out there, and are there things that we could be doing that we're not doing here?
So there are some programs at the city or town levels through homeowners should go directly to their planning department or the zoning department, depending on the community. In Providence, it's planning department with CDBG funds and other programs. There are home repair, home improvement funds. Even if you as the homeowner don't income qualify, if you have tenants, you may qualify. Certainly organizations like your organization, Carrie, are resources to homeowners as well. We do still have a state historic credit on the books as well too, that property owners who live in historic properties can qualify to do some basic improvements and maintenance on their property and get a state tax relief from that. If they're trying to make modifications to their home, particularly if they're trying to age in place or have residents who are trying to age in place, they may qualify for some of the programs through the Commission on Disabilities as well. But I think you're raising an important point, is that those programs very quickly get oversubscribed and there's never enough money. I would also point out that there is lead money, there's energy efficiency money that you can access through either Rhode Island Housing and or the city again directly, that could be resources for people to make those improvements and changes to their home. So there are some, I'm not sure that there are enough for the demand and need, but there are some resources for that homeowners can use to keep their property. Homeowners like us or advocates like us talk all the time about we want to help people attain, maintain, and retain their housing. And so the maintain programs are what we focused on in that answer and trying to link people up to those resources. I'm sure I forgot something and perhaps my other colleagues can add anything to the list that I forgot.
If anyone wants to jump in, feel free. If not, we can get to it later.
Okay.
All right. Excellent. We're going to move on actually to Amanda DeGrace from the city of Providence. And Amanda is the director of real estate for the Providence Department of Planning and Development, as well as the Providence Redevelopment Agency. Before coming to Providence, Amanda was a project manager at Grace Management Solutions, a real estate advisory firm in Massachusetts. She is a proud New Bedford native, and she's worked in the nonprofit sector for about 10 years, mostly restoring historic landmarks and houses. So she's going to certainly bring to us her own expertise as well as the work that the city has been doing in this area. Amanda?
Well, thank you for having me. Jessica Lance couldn't make it, but I'm glad to be here. And Carrie, if you are able to pull up my slides, I know that I was having a bit of technical difficulty.
There we are.
Thank you. So I'm going to present a general overview of this topic as the city watches, understands, and supports and looks ahead. And so far, we can say housing is happening in Providence. But to be sure, we're going to start by looking at the downtown. As you walk through for any of the pavement pounders, you'll be able to see a variety of developers and developments to activate that core, to provide that 24/7 walking traffic. You've got consistent eyes on the street that improves livability and deters crime. Now, the next question you should be asking me, and you will, is what's going on outside of the core of downtown? Next slide, please. This is just one view of housing right now. Providence is home to many historic mills, and they are adaptively being reused from housing. You see this in Wanscuff, you see this in Oleville and Elmwood successful models. This is a trend that you are seeing across New England as mills, their layouts lend to many uses and they carry a high square footage that is appealing if you want to create multiple units. Now, as we all know, this is just one option within the city, and there are plenty of multifamily housing throughout neighborhoods. But the next question you are going to press is this all affordable? Next slide, please. We are all beyond whether or not affordable housing is important, it's necessary, it's possible, it's even profitable with the right incentive, but it does need its own push. So yes, housing is happening in Providence, but according to the city's new anti-displacement and housing strategy that has just been released in February, 64% of Providence households are cost burden, and 29% earn less than 30% AMI. The 50% AMI in general, and that is the lower income sector, generally are substantially underserved still. Within this strategy plan, the city recognizes it can still call for 850 price appropriate units per year. That means that our market still can handle 850 units in order to build out of this crisis. So the answer there is we need to build more, and we need to build more of everything. The strategy also accepts the challenge of affordable homeownership options between the 50 to 100% AMI and low income. These are ambitious goals, and at the risk of saying that that money can solve everything, it is helpful. Next slide, please. Public funding in itself is a tool that can propel equity and protect a project's mission. And these grant awards come with general restrictions and expectations since they hold that long-term stake. So public funding is one of those things that you hope that the red tape could still stand and do what red tape is indeed intended to do. I personally believe that when you're looking for equity, whether it be project or program, you can see it right within its budget and its subsidies. So these are just a few examples of affordable and mixed income. The first one you're looking at is Westfield Lofts, created by West Elmwood CDC. That's a transformation of the Rye Fastener complex. These are 2 mill buildings within the brownfields area. This was 69 units with 22 affordable, and funding included city home funds. This project was completed in 2010 and is a society favorite. It was awarded by the Providence Preservation Society. An expansion to that is Westfield Common. This is the second phase of the Rye Fastener complex and added the Perkins building with 5,000 square foot commercial office space. Again, you'll see funding there with historic tax credit, EPA, brownfields cleanup, Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation, and PEDP lending, and that was completed in 2011. For the Sankofa apartments, also created by West Elmwood Housing, that was new construction on 10 blighted vacant lots with resident demand of open space, and a partnership with Groundwork RI allowed for a community garden and world market. This created 50 units, low income, at a cost of at least 13 million, and receives significant public funding that included Rhode Island Housing. That was completed in 2016. The last one to call out here is 60 King Street, because really this kind of work doesn't need to solely lay at the responsibility of nonprofits. 60 King Street with Trinity Financial, that was a project collaboration with CDC's SWAP and One Neighborhood Builders, and that helped them identify the building within the Build Oleville plan. This project has 16 units, 47 under 60% AMI, 7 under 30% AMI, and 6 in market rate. And again, you see multiple buckets here in order to make that work, including LIHTC, Historic Tax Credit, Rhode Island Housing, RIDEM, Brownfield, and the City of Providence Home Funds. So what we're seeing here is that partnerships can push for long-term. But for this group, well, long-term affordability, I should say, but for this group, that is absolutely not enough. The next question you're going to ask is, okay, this is great work, but there are only so many mills in Providence. What about other historic landmarks? And that brings us to our next slide. Properties already must solve multiple challenges to become affordable, but compliance with historic landmarks adds another complex layer. So this is just a list of issues that we in the planning department have witnessed when it comes to trying to marry affordable housing and historic preservation. 1, zoning. There are many historic structures that are out of sync with the underlying zoning. So just as an example, you could have a schoolhouse in an R1, R2, R3 zone, but if you want to convert it into a multifamily, that means that you need to switch that zoning to an R4. That process in itself could become a major hindrance in a project timeline. And the city aims for streamlined policies for ability to change an optimal use. For example, in 2014, we worked to change the process for easier adaptive reuse in downtown commercial and former industrial areas. And our next target is going to be adaptive reuse of large structures, but within residential areas. Aside from zoning, there is permitting. For all projects, a developer would need to coordinate with different agencies for permitting and mitigation. Here you could think of RIDEM, NBC, DPW, DIS, but then adding to that, there could be historic designation requirements that you need to consider. So aside from the permitting of this project, you're also asking yourself, well, if I want to utilize historic tax credit, is it on the National Register yet? How do I get it on the National Register? What is the timing of that? Could I make any changes to stabilize this property before that process is completed? Could I knock down that structural wall to get the layout that I'm looking for to make these units work? Aside from the concerns of historic designation and making sure that you are still working on an authentic project that respects the landmark, there is the environmental remediation. Landmarks can be neglected with time, or brownfields can happen just based on their historic use. Sometimes a brownfield is a brownfield because that site was used well for the purposes that it was intended to have in the past. So from there, you would need to be concerned with compliance with RIDEM, EPA, or lead programs. And those programs can be in conflict. Just as an example, with Lead Safe Providence, you can keep windows as long as they are stripped to be in compliance. But are you working with another program where you cannot keep those windows? And in that case, maybe you can still keep them, but you should know that before you make any sort of costly decisions in stripping the windows that you do have. There are also energy efficiency standards. When it comes to just R ratings and insulation, we are living to higher, better quality standards, but that can conflict with the older housing stock and what it could handle. And there's also with rehabilitation standards, there's sometimes code and program requirements do not intersect. So with our structural expectations in general have changed over the years, and we expect high performance. But as I love to say, sometimes when you dedicate yourself to working with a landmark and redeveloping a landmark, sometimes you are also working with old bones that just don't want to bend, and you have to be mindful of that to still make the project work, and it can be costly. There's also, when you're making all these choices, the general cost of reasonableness. You might need to justify all of your expenses to different funders. So depending on if you're looking at a housing subsidy or a historic preservation subsidy, they might have different expectations. So when it comes to the general approaches of cost savings, how do you balance out saving money to ensure that you are creating affordable housing, but also keeping it to the quality that it is still authentic and respectful to the landmark itself? Next slide, please. I am just going to do a quick shout out to projects that are now in design or under construction. Barbara Jordan 2 with Omni Development Corporation. This is new construction. I need to add that caveat, but it has 83 units within 12 buildings. There was tough decisions to be made here because there were existing buildings along this lot that there needed to be choices about whether to demo or whether to save it. And it came down to understanding what kind of quality housing you can make with the existing older buildings that were on the site. And ultimately they demoed and it became a new construction site. But again,
yeah, Amanda, that's a really good discussion that I'd actually like to push towards the end of our conversation, because I think that's something I would like everyone to be able to jump in on, because it's a part of a larger discussion that we have about how we make those choices.
Great. So just noting then, Paragon Mill, another recent successful model within Oleville, 101 units. 44 are restricted to 60% AMI, and that includes 3,000 square foot. Funding there includes, again, different streams of funding to make it work: LIHTC, affordable housing trust lending, and that should be completed in 2022. Next slide, please. And just in the interest of time, just looking ahead here, the city nor Providence Redevelopment Agency own the Superman building. But of course, we must recognize that an apartment conversion may be a viable use option to save this landmark. Shifting to a much smaller project, 22 Rye Street, former Ralph Street School. The Providence Redevelopment Agency does own this landmark, this building, and we had released an RFP, but a developer wasn't awarded. And right now we are looking at a feasibility study to outline potential affordable housing choices. So we are looking to do more of the homework that potential developers can respond to, such as having a better idea of exactly how many units this landmark this building can hold. It is at 17,000 feet, 17,000 square feet. Next slide, please. And with that being said, if you are interested in any programs, city is sometimes your first step. within zoning, license, and permitting. And as Brenda mentioned, there are home funds, home repair available, lead safe, CDBG. The Providence Redevelopment Agency has also released a Providence Affordable Housing Trust program with low interest lending. So anyone is free to contact me with any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. Appreciate all of that. I'm going to quickly turn it over to James Comer, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Rhode Island Housing. He's formerly the Executive Director of Women's Development Corporation. And prior to joining the Women's Development Corporation, he was the Director of Operations at the Cambridge Housing Authority and Director of Field Operations for the Fall River Housing Authority. James, why don't you take it off? Are you able to share your screen?
We're all about to find out together, Carrie.
Okay. Yes.
You guys can see that?
We can.
Okay, I cannot, but I'm going to take your word for it. All right, sorry. Let me slide back to the beginning. We'll talk a little bit about the historic preservation of affordable housing. But we'll get started a little bit, and apologies because I don't have this in front of me, so I'm going to do a little bit of a slide here. About Rhode Island Housing, who we are and what we do. We are the State Housing Finance Agency. So there are 54 housing finance agencies, all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, and the City of New York has their own because they are special and not just because I was born there. We provide home mortgages for single family homes. We also provide mortgages for large multifamily developments. We administer federal leased housing and rental assistance programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the Home Program, the Housing Trust Fund Program. And basically our role is to, in every way possible, finance the development of affordable housing. As I said, that's on a single family level, on a multifamily level. We're now moving into workforce housing, naturally occurring affordable housing as well. We are your one-stop shop for money if you want to develop affordable housing. We are increasingly also, along with great organizations like Brenda's, kind of a policy shop as well. And we do a lot of work to support the state and to support individual municipalities on what they're doing to deal with their affordable housing needs and what some of the data is that we can access from our many years, 4 decades of doing these type of deals. We have a lot of information and we're able to share that now because for a long time, a lot of it was in boxes and now it lives in a database and it's a wonderful thing. So our impact, we just did a little snapshot over roughly the past 15 to 16 years. We have financed 241 affordable housing developments with nearly 14,000 units in the state. Of those, 14 have received state or federal historic tax credits since 2005. These are important tools for creating affordable housing because when you build or preserve affordable housing, it's not generally a one source deal. There are, a patchwork of different funding sources which make it all work and make the finances work. And, here in Rhode Island, we have the third oldest housing stock in the country. And so we are challenged when we have properties that come to us with, as Amanda talked a lot about, the mill buildings and things like that, where there are impediments and obstacles to successfully developing it. So we are charged with working with developers to put together a financing package that will work. And as I said, a big piece of that is the federal and state historic tax credits. Both the federal and now the state historic tax credits offer a 20% tax credit taken over a 5-year period for qualified expenses. Oftentimes for us, a lot of our developers are nonprofit developers, and so they don't have a tax liability per se. They can then sell those tax credits to an investor and receive upfront cash to do the work that they need, whether it's acquiring redevelopment, construction work on the property. We have the 14 developments and the 1,000 units that we've used federal and state historic tax credits on represent about 7% of the units that were funded during that time. It's a small group, but it's a very significant one for us because you get to do some really cool projects. It can be a challenge having this much old housing, but it's also a real opportunity because so much of it is really well built, so much of it is really beautiful and represents the communities that it's situated in. Amanda talked a little bit about 60 King Street in Oleville here in Providence. It was the Imperial Knife Company factory built in 1932. We financed 60 mixed income units at a total cost of $22.5 million, of which they received $3.9 million in historic tax credit for about almost $65,000 per unit towards the cost of development, and $3 million in state historic credit proceeds, about $50,000 per unit. So of the $22.5 million, nearly $7 million came from the historic tax credits. It's money that we would not have been able to access otherwise, as with these deals, the developers have to basically tend to max out the other sources that we have to offer. And so, you know, this is a tremendous adaptive reuse of a great historic property that for many years was a generator of commerce and jobs in the Oleville neighborhood, and lay fallow for quite some time until one neighborhood builders was able to bring it back and create a mixed-use development here with 60 units. It was really a great success story that doesn't happen without the use of federal and state historic tax credits. Another smaller property that we were able to do was That's for Tomorrow in the Wanskuck neighborhood of Providence. It's the old Heaton and Cowing Mill, again built in 1932. It was a good year for mill construction. And it has 20 units for veterans who either have experienced or are at risk of experiencing homelessness. The total development cost was $5.2 million. They received $787,000 in federal historic tax credits, about $39,000 per unit, and nearly $600,000 in state historic tax credits, or about $29,000 per unit. Again, not the largest funding they received, but completely critical, because without it, we wouldn't have been able to do the deal. And significantly, we wouldn't have been able to do this deal. And by that, I mean, one of the great things that we get to do is preserve the character of these buildings for newer generations to experience. And as part of that, preserve a lot of the character of the neighborhoods in which they're situated. You know, we see, I'm sure each one of us in our own communities have seen a lot of change over time and a lot of turnover in types of the quality of housing, the types of housing, the types of the commercial and industrial buildings that you have. And certainly sometimes those things need to go because they've outlived their useful life, but you do lose a bit about what makes a place a place. You lose a bit about the historic character, the history of the people who have lived there, who have come before, and why a place kind of grew up the way that it did. So for us to be able to employ our own tools along with the federal and state historic tax credit, it's a great opportunity to really preserve these as resources for coming generations, even if not in the way that they were originally built or intended. So there are a lot of benefits to the historic preservation of affordable housing. Ashton Mill here, Ashton Village, is a great example of what I was talking about. It's a mill village that was built up around Ashton Mill on the Blackstone River, and it was housing for the people who worked in the mill, and it's all clustered around the mill. And the folks lived there. They walked to work every day. There was a company store that they bought stuff from the company. They were paid, right there. They were, places to eat and places to do other business. And it just was this little ecosystem in a part of Cumberland that all came together around when they built Ashton Mill. And it has a lot of character, and it's something that we didn't want to lose. So we were able to work with Valley Affordable Housing to preserve that with a variety of tools. It lets us, revitalize the communities, maintain that community feel, and it integrates affordable housing into the community in a way that's not obtrusive and in a way that's not disruptive to what people like about where they live. People, appreciate Ashton Mills being part of the community. It had, gotten a little bit on in years and had fallen down a little bit. And we were able to revitalize that and house deserving people in a place that is, a great historic representation of the history of work along the Blackstone and the way that a lot of Rhode Island became prosperous and succeeded over the years. As I said, the historic tax credits are a great additional tool, and they bring equity that we otherwise would not be able to access, and probably in many cases would not be able to move a project forward without. So I've talked a lot about, the upside of the historic tax credit and the upside of why historic preservation is great. It doesn't come without challenges. I'd also like to highlight again in Providence, what we call the Parkus block. It's basically a one block area on Parkus Ave that stopped wasting abandoned property, redeveloped almost all of the houses and you can see there these beautiful kind of historic houses, mansard roofs, and just really, like you stepped out of the 19th century. They're able to preserve an entire block using some of our funds and historic preservation tools. It is a challenge, though, at times, because as you can imagine, construction costs more. There are challenges with energy efficiency. So the building envelopes are not as tight as you would build now. The windows, the masonry, and the trim, oftentimes, in order to qualify for the preservation credit, have to be preserved in largely the same state with some upgrades, but that doesn't necessarily lend it to being the most energy efficient. Or, an argon-filled double pane window wouldn't quite work in a building like that. Sometimes the layout of the building and the spaces in the walls and the way that the plumbing is put in or the electrical, it makes new technology difficult to install. So there are a lot of challenges and a lot of problems that have to be solved by the architect, the engineers, and the contractor when working with a historic space that they can't really alter that much. You sometimes see a lack of flexibility in design. So, it's no secret that people 100 years ago were smaller, had fewer things, had different needs than we do now. And the buildings are sometimes chopped up in a way that we wouldn't necessarily do in this day and age, that are not necessarily conducive to modern life. And you have to work around that a little bit. And oftentimes working with and I want to parse my words carefully in case there are folks from local historical commissions or boards on this call who might come after me in the old fashioned of pitchforks and torches, but sometimes it can be a complicated and burdensome process. It is a longer process. There's a lot more review than if we were building new or if we were, renovating a non-historic property. There's obviously the oversight, as people discussed, from zoning and planning and from the municipality, but also it's an extra layer of historic preservation approval that has to be gone through that can be time-consuming in its thoroughness. I'll put it that way. And on the operating side, from a developer's perspective, these cost more to operate because, as I said, they're not as energy efficient. You're going to have increased utility costs. In particular cases, gas can be twice as much because of the way that it's distributed through the buildings and the heavy reliance on gas. When if you're building it new, you might use electric, you might use heat pumps, you might use a much more economical way of heating a building. And there's one really big challenge when we have historic properties to redevelop and remediate, and that is the fact that many of these properties that were built before 1978 have lead paint in them, or have had lead paint dust somewhere on the property, or have layers of lead paint buried beneath layers of non-lead paint as it's been painted over the years. And this really involves a lot of challenges. We have a very high incidence of housing with lead paint here in Rhode Island because of the age of the housing. And it is something that is a great health risk, as many of you can understand. Lead poisoning in children is irreversible. It is something that is responsible for a lot of delayed development, ongoing illnesses, negative health outcomes later in life. And so it's something that obviously is a very big challenge for us in dealing with these properties. There's, again, increased cost and challenges is very prescribed methods to remediating lead paint that involve people being out of their apartments, involves a clean environment being constructed. It involves, for historic purposes, and we use a project that I myself was the developer for at Shannock Falls in Charlestown. All of the siding was contained lead paint. And initially, the State Historic Preservation Office wanted us to remove each piece of siding individually, remove the lead paint from the siding, repaint and reinstall the original siding, which was 100 years old. In some cases, the paint was all that was holding the siding together, frankly. So we quickly determined that for financial reasons, for actual practical reasons of just the building components being so deteriorated, that wasn't a feasible way to go. But had we had to do that, that would have been an enormous cost increase and would have been a great delay to getting that particular building you see there occupied by 3 families, including a family with a disabled individual on the first floor. We were able to replace most of that siding in kind and do it in a way that was, in terms of the building methods and in terms of the product and the colors, because color is a big deal when you're doing this. It's important to replicate historic colors. We were able to create a really vibrant look to the property and retain the historic character without having to put back a 100-year-old clapper. It was to the benefit of the property, and it was, you know, a very good collaboration with the state historic preservation folks to get them to understand, here's what we need to do. And they said, okay, that does make sense. We would be onerous for you to try and save this 100-year-old siding. One of the tools we have, and this is my little plug for our stuff, for homes with lead paint, is Rhode Island Housing's Lead Safe Homes RI. It provides funding for the remediation of lead paint. It's prioritized for houses that have children 6 or younger living or visiting, and or a pregnant woman resides, because those are the folks most at risk from lead poisoning. There's an income cap of 120% of area median income, which is $86,500 for a family of 4 in most of the state. And in most instances, the funding is provided as a forgivable loan. What we're working on with some of our funding is actually turning it into grant funding. We previously had it as a forgivable loan so that somebody had to hold the property for a length of time after we provided the financing, and then it would be forgiven after 5 or 10 years. So folks, it wasn't accessed by flippers, but we have other tools to ensure the continued affordability of the property. And we, just for the ease of use and the ease of access, we're moving most of our funds on the federal side to be grant funds, which we're really excited about. We think we'll move funds even more quickly. A lot of the work that gets done, this provides new windows and doors, exterior and interior painting, remediation of the soil on the site. And the income is based on the person who resides in the home, not necessarily the owner. So that's what the guideline is. It's meant to serve houses with low income individuals. So that is, if you are someone who is above 120% area median income, but you have tenants that are not, you can access this program. And we do have limited funding for programs for folks above 120% area median income. That would in fact be in the form of a loan, not a grant in that instance. But we work directly with the Historic Commission to make sure any of the renovations that we do under the Lead Safe program are historically appropriate and accurate. Again, it's a great tool to be able to do this. We love doing historic preservation. We hope to continue to do it throughout the state. Providence, the city of Providence, has been a great partner in a lot of the projects that I've highlighted here and that Amanda highlighted in her presentation. And we're always gratified when we can use our funding tools in tandem with federal and state historic credits to preserve these great resources and preserve the character and feel of some of our great historic neighborhoods.
James, on the Lead Safe Homes Rhode Island program, I know you said it would cover new windows and doors. What about remediation of existing windows, wood windows, original doors?
Absolutely. It's basically on the needs of the property when we do an assessment. So if the windows themselves are in good shape and are, functional and they're doing what they need to do, and we can remediate the lead paint without destroying the window, basically, we can absolutely work to retain the building components as is. It's not always a replacement. It's sometimes, we had a long policy conversation about, if somebody has wood siding, it's not in a historic context, but somebody has wood siding, can we replace it with vinyl if it's more economical and the owner wants the vinyl replacement? And so we do have some flexibility within our guidelines to do that. But if there are historic elements to a building, we will work with the local historic commissioner of the state to remediate those without damaging the historic character or removing the historic building components that exist.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
No problem.
And then I think you can take down your slides and we'll move along. I'm going to turn us over to Melina Lodge, who's the executive director of the Housing Network of Rhode Island, which is the State Association of Community Development Corporations. Prior to coming on board at the Housing Network, Melina worked at Rhode Island Housing and at the Warm Center, and she serves on so many committees we wouldn't even be able to continue to name all of them, but most importantly, the Housing Resource Commission and the Housing Opportunities Advisory Committee. Melina, why don't you take it from here?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And I do not have a presentation. And luckily, everybody ahead of me did such an excellent job presenting stuff I would have presented anyway. We've killed two birds with one stone, and I'll be short to not be redundant, other than to really affirm the points that Brenda made around affordability and zoning and access to housing, the points that Amanda so keenly pointed out, many of which are our members. We represent 17 nonprofit developers around the state. We're a statewide policy advocacy organization, and we serve as the backbone organization for Homes RI, which is a coalition building exercise to elevate the importance of housing in our state decision-making. But I'll just reaffirm the list that Amanda had put in one of her slides around, what are some of the potential barriers to coupling affordable housing with historic preservation. When I spoke to our membership about it, there did seem to be broad consensus around the value of historic preservation as placemaking and preserving the integrity of historical buildings and neighborhoods and a community feel. That really translated to more of an intangible value as opposed to maybe something more concrete in the dollars and cents terms. I think the larger sentiment, as we talked through it, was that we have these competing priorities. And I think that's where Amanda's list sort of captures that, right? Is we can't be all things to all people in all places at exactly the same time. And so how we navigate the environmental constraints of a site, which adds costs sometimes, how we look at energy efficiency, which is also a high priority within our state development plans, right? That historical structures don't always lend themselves to retrofitting or like spatially, like maybe a 14-foot high ceiling doesn't heat as well. And I say this sitting in a historic mill building that is our office. The temperatures are definitely difficult to control. We have the land use policy around zoning, something that maybe was a commercial space at one point isn't necessarily residential, usable for residential. There's site remediation sometimes that needs to happen. And then there's the community feeling around whether they actually want to allow for a zone change in order to allow affordable housing to happen. And I think, all of those costs add up. And unfortunately, sometimes misalign with what affordable housing is, which is the ability to provide housing cheaper. And we can't do that when all of these other costs exist, because by design, affordable housing is not meant to be profitable. So programs like the state historic tax credit program and the federal tax program and anything else that can help really become critical resources to make sure that that is an option for our developers to consider when they're looking at a project and trying to decide whether the building warrants, retaining it, or if it's a tear down and it makes sense to just start over. So in the interest of keeping it short and letting Peter have a chance before questions happen, I'll cut it off there and answer any other questions in the question and answer section.
Thank you, Melina. Plenty to talk about, I think, as we move past into that. And I say this as someone who straddles both these worlds on a regular basis. I'm going to turn it over now to Peter Asen, who's the Director of Strategy Development for Providence Housing Authority. He oversees strategic planning, resident engagement, and policy development. Prior to this, he was the Director of the City of Providence Healthy Communities Office under Mayor Angel Tavares, and the Director of Intergovernmental Relations under the current Mayor Lorza. Peter?
Thank you. I am going to, I think what I'm presenting relating to public housing specifically is going to connect to a lot of what's been said before. I am going to specifically just focus on the public housing program, although with discussion later, there are some connections with how our Housing Choice Voucher Program ties into some of the specific projects that were mentioned as well. The PHA, our housing authority, we believe we're the largest landlord in the state of Rhode Island. We own and operate 2,606 units of public housing. And we have a similar about 2,700 units of tenant-based and project-based rental assistance as well through the Section 8 program. This is a picture of Chad Brown, which is one of the oldest public housing developments in the state and in the country, and was completed in 1941. It currently has 375 apartments in the One-Scuck neighborhood of Providence. For us, almost all, with the exception of the last couple hundred of our 2,600 apartments, were built starting at this time, even pre-World War II, up until the high-rise buildings were mostly built in the late 1960s to early 1970s. I think it's consistent for the most part for public housing. Congress actually froze in place the number of public housing units that could be built in 1998, tied to the number that there were at that time. So basically, any new public housing that could be built would only be replacing existing that was taken away from that time. So most of what there is old. Congress over time has really not funded the capital needs of public housing to the extent that that's necessary. We're dependent on the federal government to fund through the capital fund program. It's estimated across the country that there's about $70 billion of unfunded capital needs in public housing. There are some new opportunities right now that are on the horizon for us and other public housing authorities. In particular, in the legislation that has not yet passed, the Build Back Better Act, there is proposals close to that amount of money that gap there, maybe $60 to $70 billion in new funding for capital for public housing. Some of it might be to build new units and not just to address those capital needs, but I think a big chunk of it potentially could be for capital needs. The other piece is the American Rescue Plan funds at the state and city level. I was part of the ARP task force in Providence, and we just recommended, and there was really unanimity among the group, that the city should dedicate 25% of its rescue plan funds to affordable housing, which is $28 million. And then at the state level, there does, no decisions have been made, but it seems like there's a big potential focus on building affordable housing as well. And I did try to kind of add to the discussion that there really does need to be a lot of funding to help preserve and renovate existing affordable housing, public housing and otherwise. The big thing that's happening with public housing is that HUD is really trying to push public housing authorities to move public housing out of the public housing program and into project-based Section 8, which they call repositioning of assets. Here is an example, a recent, from a couple months ago, article in the New York Times about a development in the Bronx that was renovated using the rental assistance demonstration program. The pitch that HUD's making with repositioning of assets is that when you are funded through the public housing program, basically the amount of money you get for operating and capital really varies from year to year based on the whims of Congress. And there is a way that you can borrow against future capital fund revenue, but that's pretty limited. And there's a lot of funders that don't want to loan money to a public housing authority when they really don't know what kind of revenue they're going to get each year. We don't have set rents where we know that a tenant is going to pay a certain amount and the subsidy is going to pay the rest. We have just grants that we get for certain amounts in it. And what happens many times is that HUD will calculate, okay, this is how much money public housing authorities need to operate. This is how much Congress has given us. And so we're going to give every public housing authority, say, 87% of the amount of money that we know they need. It's called a proration. So it just means in 1 year we may get 87%, 1 year we may get 91%. Very rarely do we get 100%. And so it's just hard to do planning when that's the way that you're funded. On the other hand, the Section 8 project-based program, is mostly private owners, for-profit and nonprofit owners, and Congress doesn't mess around as much with that. They basically provide, set rents, and if anything, they may get a small inflation increase from year to year. So HUD has now said, look, for public housing authorities, you may be better off if you take your public housing and you transfer it over to the Section 8 platform. In some cases, this has been done together with privatization of management. That's something in Providence we're really not interested in doing, but that has accompanied the RAD program in a lot of places. This is a, I mentioned, we haven't also gone through the RAD program yet here in Providence and haven't made decisions about what to do or what the best option is because the options have grown in terms of the different programs and the different incentives that HUD has to try to encourage this movement outside of the traditional public housing program. This is a picture or before and after pictures of Prospect Heights, which is a development in Pawtucket, which is on the National Historic Register, in which this redevelopment was funded in part with federal historic tax credits, among many other sources. I know the former director of Pawtucket Housing came to our board and presented on this and talked about it was a years-long effort to raise the funds from many different sources to do this redevelopment. The way that the RAD program typically works, or when it started, was that you're not going to get any more or less money when you move from public housing to Section 8. You're kind of working on, say, the year that you're in is like a baseline. And rather than getting money in these different pots, a capital pot, an operating pot, you just have rents that are set. And again, and like a regular private affordable owner, you charge the tenant their portion based on their income, and HUD gives you the remainder. So there's more flexibility you don't have this one pot of money that you can't use to fix a leak in a roof because it's supposed to be only for operation and not for capital repairs, things like that, or to address other, broader capital issues that come up. When you do, one of the selling points for these programs is that there is an ability to then leverage programs like the low-income housing tax credit or other lending from other funders and other grant programs where sometimes it's trickier to be able to get different kinds of funding to support public housing, given the way it's funded now. I mentioned there are some new opportunities that HUD's putting out, some additional ways to actually have increased funding rather than just maintain the same amount of funding. I think we've had some housing authorities come back to HUD and say it's just not going to work for us to go through RAD with some of the housing that we have. And HUD's recognizing certain types of housing. For example, we have 244 scattered site apartments, and they're recognizing the real challenges around cost efficiency of maintaining those and coming up with kind of more incentives to look at moving those developments into these new funding platforms. It basically, in a lot of cases, you can get like a housing voucher to replace the subsidy, and then the rents that we pay out to owners with housing vouchers are really higher than the rents or the amount of funding that we get for our public housing. So there's a chance to potentially get some additional revenue that way, and then again, leverage more financing that way. There is, I mentioned the 1998 limits on public housing, which is called the Fair Cloth Act. There is an opportunity if your housing authority has reduced your number of units since that time, and there's about 730 units in Rhode Island below the limits that all the housing authorities had at that time. There's an opportunity when you do this kind of redevelopment to use that capacity to add additional units and get additional subsidy from HUD through the RAD program. In Providence, that opportunity is pretty limited. We're basically only 24 units below what we had in 1998, but that still could be, that 24 units could be something that as part of a redevelopment, we can add some new apartments as well. A very important piece from HUD's standpoint, and I think from our standpoint as we look at it with RAD is the rights of residents and communication to residents. There can be a lot of fear and concern about what's going to happen. There is, rights that residents have around the relocation if there's temporary relocation that has to happen and disruption to their lives. And there's a lot of costs and challenges associated with that, particularly if as you are in our case, we have 97% or so of our units are occupied at any given time, sometimes more. So when you have very few vacant units, that relocation piece is more of a challenge. So this is Chad Brown in 2020, not the same angle as the original picture I showed, but just wanted to bring us up to the future, to the present. I did mention the Prospect Heights, the historic tax credit program. Chad Brown is a historic development as well as one of the first public housing in the state. So there are some opportunities with some public housing to look at historic tax credit programs. James talked about, redevelopment and the additional costs. How do we address that? Are there specific funding opportunities that help us to address that? Now, in the near future, we're looking at, as I mentioned, all this new funding on the horizon. In some cases, some of that funding would be accessible even if we remain in the public housing program as opposed to this Section 8 program. And so is that going to change the calculus of, whether people need to go through that RAD program in order to access the money they need to really make major improvements? I did talk about expanding the number of units. Chad Brown, for example, is our largest site in terms of the number of acres. There is some additional space there. So I think as we look at redevelopment, the idea, knowing how great of a need there is for more affordable housing, or even, workforce and mixed, income housing, that we need to look at whether we can build more. Some of the things that I would say are maybe historic about older public housing are things that we may not want to retain. We do have extremely small bedroom sizes, small closets. We don't have dining rooms in all these older apartments, things like that. So I think that's one of the things that we want to look at is, updating and improving and modernizing. There still may be opportunities to maintain the historic character from the outside and things like that, but also seeing that not everything that was historic is for the best, best interests of the residents. And I'm just putting this back up again because I have my email there if anyone has any questions that you want to follow up on as well.
Thank you, Peter. All right, we are going to open up to question and answers, and while people get their questions in, and we do have one which I'll get to in just a minute, I do want to get back to this discussion regarding making the decisions about retaining historic structures versus starting at with new construction. And I would just like to sort of throw into this conversation the fact that demolishing a structure does not come without cost. Clearly, that has to always be part of the equation as well. And to think about larger scale buildings, this could be a tremendous cost. There's also a fair amount of energy and effective building that has happened within the older structures. And I think that, from my point of view, I think that it is something that we ought to spend a fair amount of time discussing and thinking about as we make those kinds of decisions. I think we can consider how we adapt some of these structures, whether it's utilizing pieces of them, being able to make adaptations on the interiors and think about different ways that we can utilize some of these structures. But I would just sort of like to bring it back to Amanda's conversation about Barbara Jordan. If you want to just talk a little bit while we're getting some questions together, that would be awesome.
So in just going back to Barbara Jordan too, I was touching on their choice of looking at that lot with existing buildings and the choices that they had to make to either retain and invest in those buildings versus demolish and start with a clean slate. I personally think that you need to always review your project's mission and stick to that. So if you have a specific project mission of maybe it is affordable housing and the affordable housing has specific qualities to it, maybe you are leaning more so to new construction or you're more open to demoing, versus if you are stepping onto a physical site that is a historic landmark. I think part of the response or something that could be designated a historic landmark, I think part of the responsibility then is to really step in not only with your best of intentions, but also your budget in preserving that structure. But that is adopting a specific labor of love towards, as I call it, the physical bones.
Thank you so much. We have one question. This one is for Brenda. Does your research show that the slow pace of new housing production is related to zoning? If so, which specific zoning ordinances slow housing production the most?
So we've, in our annual fact book, we included some additional data about zoning, and as many of you know, there is a commission currently, two commissions currently underway at the State House. One looking specifically at our state's low to moderate income housing act that sets a goal for every community to have at least 10% of their housing stock as affordable. And there's also a land use commission looking at overall kind of where we grow and where we develop as a state. There are 17 municipalities, and that includes Providence East Side, that allow multifamily zoning by right. And zoning is a big barrier in many communities. There are a number of the remaining 23 municipalities in their state. At least some of them have water and sewer or access to partial water and sewer, and could allow denser development as well. But you can't really talk about zoning without also talking about infrastructure and talking about how do we put more incentives in the zoning laws to allow more multifamily building and development. I was just on, and in Providence, that means that we've got to go up a little higher, right? And I know there was not too long ago a big controversy with the building on Westminster Street that a private developer wanted to go up 4 or 5 stories, and they did build it. I think it's a 4-story building, but there was a lot of neighborhood opposition and said that that's too high, and we don't want to go that high. But on the spines and on the urban's main corridors in these neighborhoods and communities, that's exactly where it makes sense to go up 3 or 4 or 5 stories as well too. So it is a barrier. There's not one thing, it's also the process and the timing that takes so long to move through. I think many of some of the matters that go to Providence Zoning Board probably should be considered more as administrative matters as opposed to going to zoning hearings. You still have to apply for a lot of variances and a lot of things, even when there's in theory multifamily zoning by right. So and that's especially true in communities outside of the urban core. So it is a factor. I don't have an easy fix for that problem as well, but it is something to look at. We have not made substantial changes in our state enabling laws around zoning for a long time. So as a state, we need to look at how to incentivize, how to create more opportunities for communities to create overlay districts, how to create tie more tax incentives to zoning as well in order to increase the supply. So that's a long answer without a real answer, but I'll stop there and happy to address any follow-up question.
That's great. Thank you so much. It was a great answer. We have a couple more questions that have come in. One is, I'm wondering about rental rate increase in Providence between 2020 and 2021 versus 2015 to 2020. I feel rental costs have skyrocketed lately.
So as I mentioned on one of my slides, we did see an increase in Providence rental rates. Trying to get the right numbers, hold on. But it's mostly also been a supply issue, right? We saw from 2015 to 2020, there was a 71% increase in the median single family home. In that same time period, we saw a 5% increase in price over the average 2-bedroom. But already in 2015, those prices were already too high, right? And too high for many individuals, particularly many individuals who during the pandemic we called essential workers, that people who are taking care of our children, working in our nursing homes, working at hospitals, cleaning our buildings, keeping us all safe during a public pandemic are the people who are most priced out of this market. They were in 2015, and as the years have gone on, they've continued to be priced out. So it is an increase, not as dramatic as the median single family home price increase, but still significant, because what does that mean? Many people who want to be in the homeowner market are not able to move from the rental market. So the vacancy numbers are really the key number to look at, and the vacancy rates in Providence remain unhealthy in the unhealthy range and low range as well. So let me stop there and see if any of my colleagues have any comments.
Yeah.
I was going to add too, just, not only is it a supply issue, but there's a demand component. And I think, in our work as a monitoring agent, so we're doing a lot of transactions relative to affordable housing. We're seeing a lot of pressures from other housing markets, right? So like we're expensive for us, but we're cheaper than Boston, or we're cheaper than New London. And so we are seeing sort of people looking to move into a cheaper housing market within a commutable distance. Obviously, as we work around with, transit and whether when the train station comes to Pawtucket, there will be a shift there around how people can access very quickly employment versus housing. And I think, more relative to COVID, and to Brenda's point, is that while, some of our most essential workers need to show up in person for those jobs, there was this discovery that a fair number of people can function from home. And what in my work, where I've seen it play out, is that there's been more mobility for people to consider housing options that maybe weren't previously accessible when they went into the office, right? So I had actually somebody purchase an affordable unit. They work for a company in Florida, but they live in Rhode Island because they like it, and they're working remotely. So I think, that has played out a little bit differently and has been a game changer for the demand, particularly when you live in an area that, is aesthetically pleasing and just a generally nice place to be. So it isn't, and that coupled with supply, it's not just a supply problem. We actually have, low supply and really high demand. And I think it's the juxtaposition of those two things that has driven pricing.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think with demand, that in Providence specifically, that I think we're seeing more demand even within the state of people wanting to live and move into Providence relative to the outlying communities. I think we run, the rental assistance Section 8 program in the city. And I think in the past, rental units in Cranston, Warwick, North Providence might have been more expensive than in Providence neighborhoods, outside of the east side, say. And now we're seeing maybe more the opposite, that it's actually can be more expensive in some cases to rent within Providence, because that's where, younger people don't want to be driving cars and things like, for many reasons, there's just a lot of interest in living in the city itself. And so I did want to just mention, in terms of the Section 8 program, we have recently, in recognition of the challenges that people are having, we've substantially, as much as we really could under the rules, increased our payment standards for what we pay to landlords. So just using this as my advertising moment to say, anyone that owns apartments that is interested in renting to Section 8 tenants, we're trying to pay as much as we can, and please get in touch, because we have many people looking right now.
Excellent. And then just as we think about how to address the clear need for more and better reasonably priced housing in Rhode Island, how are these organizations, all of your organizations and my own, I will say, working together to ensure that we can, come up with a plan that works holistically and effectively? And how can the preservation sort of movement and advocates work to support the work that we're doing? And I will just say, for myself, part of it is being able to have financing that's available to developers to be, particularly sort of some of the hardest financing to find, some bridge financing and pre-development money that can go into historic projects, but in particular to really promote mixed income, mixed use developments, which really allow for the increase in units, which is, which is so desperately needed. And I think, Brenda's facts about whose cost burden presents the fact that while obviously this, those that are severely cost burdened and on the lower end of the income spectrum generally tend to have harder choices. We see those who are cost burdened across many, many parts of the income areas, and and that we just have a significant need for more housing.
Mm-hmm. So Carrie, I think in part it's, we're really good at planning in Providence. I think, all of us have sat in on gazillion planning plans, and, and the plan, thanks to planning staff and others, the plan that Providence has now isn't bad. The plan that we years ago referred to as the Sokolov plan that many of us used to implement focus areas and focus groups and neighborhoods in Providence was also not bad. The problem is always political will to implement. And so I think part of what we need to do as housing and preservation is keep everybody's feet to their fire and say, okay, this is great. You said this, now where are the results? And as we embark on both a mayoral and a gubernatorial election next year, we have to keep our elected officials accountable. We have to set reasonable goals, which I think there are reasonable goals in the Providence plan, and just start to do it. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have to pull back on some things. We're going to have to change direction, but let's just start, and let's just start building at this point. I'm tired of talking and I'm tired of planning.
Oh, I'm with you.
One piece that we're doing, just mention, is we've been dedicating more of our Section 8 subsidies to project-based vouchers, which is where we could contract with an owner for a 20-year period to semi-permanently subsidize units. So we have to do that through an RFP process, but the most recent RFP we just finished, we actually did award some units to the Barbara Jordan 2 redevelopment that was shown. There's another new project that people may not be familiar with, but that I'll mention, which is called Copley Chambers. It's a building that was built in 1913 that's on Broad Street that's been vacant for many years. And the developer who did the arcade downtown is looking to build 26 units of housing in that building, and a lot of those are going to be reserved for people experiencing homelessness. So that's a way that we could take a resource we have and be kind of one of the funding sources, and also ensure that units in some of these developments do serve people at that lowest income level.
Yeah, and Peter, we just need other PHAs to follow your example and do more of that throughout the state. So, and we're really grateful for the leadership at Providence.
Thank you.
Well, as we have very few minutes left, I'm just going to once again thank all the panelists for joining us tonight. I think this has been a really robust and interesting conversation, and one that I think we need to continue. And Brenda, you are correct. We need to start building. And I think, we would look for all of those of us who are interested in housing in any way to join in thinking about how we make sure we just start getting the work done. And I thank all of those who have joined us tonight, and I hope you enjoyed our presentations. And we are all available off of this presentation to continue this conversation and to answer questions. And I'm sure that the Providence Preservation Society staff will make sure that our contact information is disseminated.
All right, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As Brent mentioned, this program continues this evening with a discussion of missing middle housing. And again, tomorrow night, we have a presentation about the racial dimensions of the real estate market. We hope to see you soon in the next day or so, if not later. And thank you for your attendance tonight.